Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, All Things Art. Eric here, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to properly fix gaps and seam lines in your models. Now, if you're familiar with 3D printing, as you know, everything comes in different parts. Things need to be glued and assembled, and those parts never seem to fit together correctly. There's always going to be a gap or a seam line somewhere that needs to be fixed. I see a lot of people in the community, they do these magnificent paint jobs, but they fail to put in the prep time to make sure all the seam lines are out, and you can still see the seam lines underneath the paint. And sorry to say it, but that looks like trash, and that's not how you want to present your project once it's painted. So make sure you put in the prep time. You want to make sure the gaps are filled in and sanded. So now there's different ways to go about doing that. I see some people like to use resin mixed with baby powder. They make a paste out of it, they smash it into the part, and then they cure it with a UV light. Personally, I don't think that looks good. Also, why work with resin, a chemical that smells, if you don't have to? And also, it just makes a mess. Another method would be to use wood glue and then sand it down. Again, that's very messy. A better method would be Milli Putty or Bondo, but personally, I like to use something called Aves Apoxy Sculpt. It's a sculpting clay. It cures within a few hours. It comes in all different colors, which might be beneficial for your project. It's easy to work with. It's easy to sand. You can work with a solvent with it, so this way it blends better and you get nice professional looking results. And I'm referring to my arm here because that's what we're fixing in today's video. We're attaching an arm to a body, specifically Shanna the she-devil right behind me here. She's already done. She's already painted. I'm doing a series of videos on her, how to paint skin tones, painting her from start to finish. So definitely stay tuned to the channel. Hit the subscribe button if you want to see all of that. But just in today's video, we're attaching her arm to her body, and we're going to fill in, there's a seam line right where my tank top shirt line is right here. So we're going to fill that in, get it nice and professional before it's painted. And so first we need to glue her arm on, and then I'm going to show you how to clean that up. And this way you don't see any seam lines underneath your paint. So let's get started. All right, and we're going to start this project off the same way we would start off any other project, and that's gluing the parts together. Gluing the arm onto the body using a 2-part clear epoxy by JB Weld. JB Weld is always my go-to brand because it cures very quickly. So now this is a 2-part epoxy of equal amounts, so we're mixing equal amounts from each bottle. Mixed together, you have a working time of 5 minutes. So again, that's why I always recommend this brand. It's extremely strong and it dries very quickly. So I can sit there and hold the parts together until it fully hardens versus trying to use a clamp and let it sit overnight, which sometimes is impossible. Another great thing about this epoxy glue is it can also be sanded, so if it gets a little bit messy and you get a little bit of overspill, it can be sanded off, but I usually like to go around with a wet Q-tip and just wipe off any excess. This way I can get on to the next step. So once the parts are glued together, here's how it's looking, and as you know with 3D printing, like I mentioned in the intro, no matter how well you might set your settings for the print or how well you glue it together, there's always fitment issues and there's always gaps and seams that need to be filled in. This particular print was printed in white, so it's hard to see on camera, but there is definitely a noticeable seam around the shoulder area, so that's what we're going to be filling in. And for that, I'm using my go-to brand, which is Aves Apoxy Sculpt. The same with the glue. It's a 2-part mixture of equal halves, so I'm taking an equal amount from each container and mixing them together. Each container is a slightly different color. One is more of a gray color and the other is a little bit more of a greenish color. So basically you want to mix the two together until they form a one uniform color. That's how you know when it's mixed. I'll usually sit there and mix it for a good 2 to 3 minutes. You can roll it around in your hand, or you can knead it around like dough within your fingers. But basically you want to mix it up until the two colors are mixed together. And then once they are fully mixed together, it's usually recommended to let it sit for a few minutes and rest before working with it. So at this point, I'm taking the sculpting clay and pushing it into the gap, and at this point you should start to see where the seam line was that wraps around her arm. As mentioned, this stuff does come in different colors. Unfortunately, I didn't have white, but it does come in white. White would have been useful for this project, or whatever color project you're working on. If it's gray or black, whatever resin color you're using, I usually like to use the same type of epoxy sculpt. This way you can kind of see how it's hiding within the cracks and crevices. But for the most part, I'm used to working with this stuff, so I'm pretty experienced with it, and I can tell when it's blended and looking nice and smooth between the two parts. So now with the sculpting clay, it is sandable, but I always recommend to try to spend more time putting it on nice and smoothly and feathering it versus trying to go back later and trying to sand it, which is more work. You could also end up covering up too many details like that. So like mentioned, I like to sit there and take my time and work it in and make it nice and smooth. So going around the gap, you want to just roughly work it into place, and then later we can feather it out and blend it together. Okay, and this is a safety solvent also made by Aves. It's recommended to work with the sculpting clay. Basically what it does is, as you're working with the clay, you have about 4 hours working time. So over those hours, you'll notice that the clay starts to harden up little by little as you're working. So the safety solvent actually helps smooth out the area and keep it a little bit more on the softer side. This way you can continue working with it. It also helps blend and gives you nice seamless feathering between the two parts. That's another reason why I like to use this brand of sculpting clay. And for feathering the sculpting clay out, I like to use a brush with a rubber tip. You can also use a paintbrush with bristles. Sometimes I will do that, but just keep in mind the clay can clump up and use your brush. So if you have some older brushes laying around, you can also use that. But I've recently started using this rubber tipped brush because it can easily be cleaned up and then used again over and over again. So we're going to go around and smash down the clay a little bit more, getting it nice and flat and even with the surface of the 3D print. That's another great thing about having the rubber tip brush. It's nice and flat, so I can get an even contour along with the 3D printed surface. And again, Aves has a different experience as you're working with it over the few hours of working time. In the beginning, it's very soft and pliable, and then it kind of hardens. So now, depending on what you're working on, you have different time frames. So if you're doing something for, like, say, gap filling, it's good to work with it when it's nice and soft. If you're actually using it to sculpt, you kind of want to find that midway point where it starts to harden. This way you can kind of sculpt it a little bit better and form different shapes out of it. But keep in mind, when it's more on the softer side, it can somewhat peel off. So it's one of those things where over time you'll learn with experience when the right time is to push down on it or bend or, you know, make certain moves with the clay. But for the most part, it's very easy to work with. You can always start over if you do screw something up, and over time it doesn't take much experience, but with slight experience you'll start to learn how it reacts over the few hours of working time that you have with it. So if I had to give a rough estimate of the time frame, I would say the first hour is good just to get the clay into place, work it around, fill in the gap. Don't push down too hard because it can peel off onto the brush or even your hands. You want to wait more towards the second hour before you start getting a little bit more rough with it and trying to feather it out. That's why it's recommended on the bottle to let it sit for a while after you mix it together, because you kind of want to let it harden up a little bit before you want to start working with it. So when it comes to feathering, you want to pull from both directions. So I'm taking the rubber tip brush and I'm pulling from one direction angle and feathering it outwards towards the arm, and then on the other side I'm feathering and pulling the brush
towards the body. This way you get a seamless blend from both sides of the epoxy sculpt. And you'll notice it's feathering once it starts to lose its color as it's moving its way outwards towards the model. It's blending more into the material. So now that I have the epoxy sculpt in place, I did some slight feathering. It's starting to harden up a little bit, so now we can go in and really start to blend and feather this out a little bit more. And now I'm going to start using the safety solvent. It'll help loosen it up just a little bit. The safety solvent has the consistency of oil, so it kind of helps smooth out the areas, and it'll give you a nice smooth blend. And same as before, I'm just going around and pulling in each direction. This way it feathers out in both directions. And again, you can go as little or as much as you want when it comes to applying the epoxy sculpt. If you want to put it on heavy and just let it cure and dry and then go back and sand it, that's perfectly fine. I personally prefer to get a nice smooth blend. This way I do less sanding. I sometimes work both ways, but personally I feel like spending the time and getting it down right, especially because this is going to be skin tones. I don't want any rough areas. I want to make sure it goes on nice and smooth, and then just do less sanding. But it depends on your project. If you have something with a lot of textures and you can better hide the epoxy sculpt, the epoxy sculpting clay, then yeah, you could probably go on a lot heavier. You don't have to worry about too much with the blending and feathering, and just kind of hide it within the textures. Okay, and here's how it's looking once everything was applied and feathered out. I'm happy with the results so far. Like I said, you could always go back and sand this, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Before you can sand, you have to let it cure for 24 hours. So I'm going to let this sit overnight, and then the next day we can come back and get it sanded. Alright, and it's the next day. Everything had time to fully dry and cure. You're going to notice there's some clay also around her neck. I noticed one of the teeth around her necklace was broken off, so I went back and sculpted that in as well. So again, this is another reason why I prefer to use this method, because one, you can sculpt with it, and two, it's also great for gap filling, so it has multi-purposes. So since we put on the epoxy sculpt nice and smooth, I don't have to do much sanding. So I'm using a 400 grit and then a 600 grit to get this sanded down. But if you decide to put it on heavier, then you're probably going to need a heavier grit, somewhere around maybe 120 to 180. So now these are sanding sponges. I like to use sanding sponges because the sponge actually allows you to follow around the contours of the 3D print. This way you don't accidentally sand off any detail. It kind of falls into place of all the recesses and crevices on the model. I'm also using wet sanding. It helps keep the dust down. This way you're not getting any dust particles in the air, and it just makes the sanding experience a little bit smoother. So I have a side container of water that I'm just dipping into every once in a while to keep the sanding sponge nice and wet. And the same way we applied the sculpting clay by feathering it out, that's the same thing I'm doing with the sandpaper and that technique. Going around and just feathering out the sanding to try to blend it in between the two parts. So now again, it's going to depend on your project. If you're working on something such as a base with a rough terrain, you might not have to do so much sanding. You can just blend the epoxy sculpt and kind of texture it. Because I'm working on a female body with skin tones, I have a smooth blend that I need to create. Otherwise, I'm going to have rough patches on her skin, which obviously I don't want. So I really need to go in and make sure this is sanded down pretty much perfectly. So if you weren't painting something that was purely flat and didn't have texture to it, then you can get away with stopping right now and then going to primer and paint. But because this is a flat surface, I'm going to be sanding off the entire sculpt other than what was filled inside of the gap. And for that, I like to use sanding sticks. They get into every little crevice. You can find these on Amazon or in any craft store. They come in all different grits. And I'm starting off with a 180 grit just to make sure I fully remove all of the sculpting clay. So we're going around and removing the sculpting clay from the outer part of her body, except for where it was filled in on the gap. And as I go around and do that, I also use my finger. This way I could feel that it's nice and smooth between the two parts and there's no rough areas or crevices or cracks anywhere. So here's how she's looking once everything has been sanded. The only thing that's left visible now is the epoxy sculpt that's in the gap. Everything else was sanded off and we have a nice smooth transition between the two parts, and we can move on to primer. And then later on, I'll show you the final result with it all painted. As for the primer, I'm using a surface primer. It can be applied within the airbrush gun. That's usually my preferred method of priming 3D printed objects because I have more control versus a rattle can. So just going around and priming this with the surface primer. Comes in all different colors, but because we're painting skin tones, I'm using a light brown color. Alright, and here's the final result once she was painted. As you can see, there's no more seam line, there's no more gap. We have a nice professional looking paint job. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. As mentioned earlier, I am doing other tutorials on this project besides painting skin tones. I'm also doing another video on the entire painting process from start to finish on this project. So if you'd like to, hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you're notified of future videos, and I'll see you next time. Take care.
Try but can't get through to me. It's not you, yeah, it's always me. I close my heart to you, you see it opens up for nobody. It's been so hard to fall asleep. The weather always makes my nose bleed. Makes my nose bleed. It's so hard to believe that one day I'll feel peace. I want control over my life. I want that driver's seat. Yeah, it's not you that I need.